Okay, you ready? I'm recording.
Section 5, getting a basic understanding of situs. Sounds like a venereal disease. I got the situs. Sorry. No, I'm going to have the giggles a minute. Learning objectives. Be able to identify the role of situs in the appraisal of personal property. State the differences between stationary, movable, and in-transit property. Recall how to apply the 4 situs rules. List some of the potential situs problems may be and how to resolve them. This section deals with determining of where an item of personal property is taxable and by whom. When personal property acquires a more or less fixed location, only those jurisdictions in which it resides can tax it. If a permanent location cannot be determined, it becomes more difficult, but laws and rules can be used for guidance. A little turkey. So, A, what is the definition of situs? Here are 3 definitions of situs found in the most recent edition of the Texas Property Tax Glossary. A, situs, the actual or assumed location of a property for purposes of taxation. In personal property, situs may be the physical location of the property, or in the instance of highly mobile property, the more or less permanent location of the property owner. B, situs tax, the place at which property is legally taxable, that is, the jurisdiction within the property actually lies or is said to lie for tax purposes. C, situs constructive, the tax situs established by reasonable rules of law or practice for intangible property, or for tangibles when they are not continuously within a given tax district for the full assessment year. For example, a constructive situs is established for freight cars by allowing to a tax district a fraction...
By allocating.
Would you look at that? Okay, for example, a constructive situs is established for freight cars by allocating to a tax district a fraction of the total number of cars owned equal to the ratio of car miles operated within the district to the total number of car miles operated within and without the district. Number 2. Therefore, situs is the presumed taxable or actual location of property, but it may depend on the specific circumstances. By the nature of the work, some businesses are more likely to have challenging situs decisions. B, key points for determining situs. Situs represents the actual or taxable location of a property for appraisal purposes. Number 2, an important issue in determining situs is whether the property is stationary, movable, or in transit. Number 3, Texas has jurisdiction to tax personal property if it is located in Texas for more than a temporary period. The chief appraiser determines what constitutes more than temporary on a case-by-case basis. Number 4, if personal property is temporarily outside Texas and the owner resides in Texas, it is taxable in Texas. Number 5, if the personal property is used continually, whether regularly or irregularly in Texas, then the property is taxable in Texas. C, property may remain permanently in place or could be movable. Number 1, stationary property. A, stationary property represents property more or less permanently located on business premises. Such property is generally subject to taxation where located. In rare occasions where property is temporarily removed, a question could arise. 2. Movable property. A basic rule to remember when appraising personal property is that movable follows the person, the mobilia rule. B, a great deal of business B, a great deal of business personal property is mobile and may or may not be located at a particular location at time of inspection. C, movable property such as watercraft, motor vehicles, aircraft, mobile homes, and construction equipment must have business premises or a more or less permanent situs from which it operates. D, such movable property temporarily removed from the business premises does not necessarily lose its taxable situs here.
There.
Okay. So E, the tax code and legal opinions offer some guidance on how to treat this type of property. Number 3, in-transit property. A, property moving interstate by common carrier or private conveyance generally cannot be taxed. This is dictated by federal law and covered by the Interstate Commerce Commission regulations and, as discussed in the previous section, exempt from local property taxes. B, if, however, the property comes to rest, such property may no longer be considered in transit and can be taxed. C, the taxing units where the chief appraiser determines that the property stopped in Texas for a business purpose would have legal authority to tax the full value of the property. D, business purpose. Number 1, this means that the direct flow of transportation has been disrupted, so something that happens to the goods changes the nature of them or adds value to them. For instance, a truckload of phone batteries stop at a facility that adds them to a phone, repackages them, and then they continue on their journey to another state. E, situs and vehicles. Number 1, movable personal property includes motor vehicles, aircraft, and watercraft, and may be taxable in more than one state. Number 2, there are 4 qualifications for taxing movable personal property involved in interstate commerce. A, there must be substantial contact between the property and Texas. B, the method of apportioning Texas's share of the value must be fair. C, Texas may not, in its policies or practices, discriminate against the interstate commerce. D, the tax burden must bear a fair relation to services provided. F, allocation of vehicle value. Number 1, allocation refers to the process of dividing a whole into its components. A, the chief appraiser in the county where situs has been established allocates the market value to reflect the property's use in Texas. B, the allocation factor is based on guidelines from the comptroller's office. These guidelines allow the chief appraiser to use differing guidelines to better reflect the usage of the vehicle. C, examples of methods for allocation include using the number of miles in Texas versus the number of miles outside of Texas, the number of days the vehicle was in the state versus the number of days outside the state, or any other method that would produce a ratio to be used for the value calculation. It simply needs to make sense. Example using days for the allocation factor on the next page. There's a big old 18-wheeler right there. Allocation example. The problem. A truck and trailer with a market value of $120,000 travels regularly between Beaumont, Texas and Lake Charles, Louisiana. If the truck was in Texas for 200 days during the past year, what would the allocated value be for Texas? 200 days divided by 365 days equals 0.5479. $120,000 times 0.5479 equals $65,748. That is the total value times the allocation factor. Number 2, use the allocation factor regardless of whether or not another state tax. Use of the allocation factor regardless of whether or not other states tax the vehicle. Companies must file an interstate allocation application each year in order to receive the allocation. G. Local situs rules. G. Local situs rules. Number 1. Tax Code Section 21.02 lays out the rules for determining situs. A. Rule 1. January 1 is the key date for determining situs if the property remains at that location for more than a temporary period. Number 1. This rule generally applies to personal property such as inventory, non-mobile equipment, raw materials, and work in process. Number 2. The date may be September 1 if the property owner has filed an application requesting this date and the chief appraiser granted the request. Rule number 2. Where personal property stopped only temporarily, or if it is on the move January 1, it has situs where it is normally located. Rule number 3. Where property is constantly on the move but has a home base in Texas where it returns between uses, it has situs at its home base. Rule number 4. Where property does not fall into any of the above 3 categories, it has situs at its owner's domicile. Number 2. What is meant by domicile? A. Non-business property has situs at the owner's residence. B. Business property has situs at the owner's principal place of business. Number 3. If not resolved with the 4 tests above, the jurisdiction that provides the property with the most benefits provided by tax dollars should tax it. H. Principal place of business. Number 1. This is the place the company does most of its business, main office, equipment, yard, etc. A. Not necessarily the same place it maintains an office or mailing address. B. Where business is chartered may be misleading. C. Really an activity-based determination. Please. I. Exceptions. Texas may not tax goods stored temporarily only for safe and efficient interstate transport. Number 2. Imported goods stored in a U.S. Customs Service bonded warehouse in a designated and active foreign trade zone are not taxable property because they are protected from duties and tariffs, and it has been determined that they are also protected from local property taxes. J. Potential situs problems. Number 1. Property may not have more than one situs in Texas. A. There is no intrastate allocation. B. Texas counties cannot share in the property of value.
In the value of property.
Yep, that too. Texas counties cannot share in the value of property. Number 2, definition of temporary period. A no set number of days. B. Appraiser must examine evidence in each case to determine how temporary applies to specific property. That doesn't make sense. An appraiser must examine evidence in each case to determine how temporary applies to specific property.
How temporary.
Oh, okay.
Specific property.
I got it. Okay. So number 3, how to handle a fleet of vehicles, rolling stock, or aircraft. A. Does a fleet have situs as a whole, or should vehicles be treated individually? B. Does movable personal property return to the same central facility, or does it stay in a localized area away from central facility? C. Situs is likely based on where the property spends most of its time and uses the most services. Number 4. Note: it is not the property owner who determines situs merely by rendering the property in a particular location. K. In summary, situs determination is a critical step in correctly listing personal property on the appraisal roll. Situs can often be controversial because the appraiser must determine the taxable location of highly mobile equipment. knowing whether the jurisdiction that intends to levy a tax are among the decisions that must be made in the discovery process. In section.